Brooklyn is changing. There's no denying that. But as Brooklyn has become a beacon of cool, many are concerned about how this change affects the average Brooklynite. And in particular, lawyers, politicians, and activists are questioning the aggressive tactics some landlords are using to force out some of the borough's existing lower and working class residents to make way for residents able to pay at or above market value for Brooklyn rentals. Now, writer D.W. Gibson shadowed one such landlord for a tour of the borough and came out with an expose of exactly how some Brooklyn landlords skirt the law to drive out what they term as undesirables. And I want to welcome D.W. Gibson to BK Live. Thank you so much for coming.
Thanks for having me.
And welcome back landlord and tenant attorney Shaker Krishan, who is also the director of the Preserving Affordable Housing Program for Brooklyn Legal Services Corp. Thank you again, Shaker, for being here.
Thanks for having me.
So let's just go ahead and jump right in. D.W., I want to start with you because you wrote this very interesting article in New York Magazine that came out last week. How is it that you got this particular landlord, Ephraim, to be so candid with you? I mean, he was very open about some of the tactics he uses on not only getting buildings in Brooklyn, but also driving out certain tenants. Tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah, well, I've been interviewing people for 3 years now talking about gentrification, and I interviewed him about 1.5 years ago. So it was in the trenches, having talked to a lot of people, having met a lot of people who know him, and I was able to gain his time and attention through mutual connection. So I think that helped a lot. And then once I was in the car with him, he was on the record for about 5 minutes. And then when he realized what I wanted to talk about, that was only going to happen if I gave him a pseudonym. So I agreed to that once I confirmed who he was and what he was doing. And there he just, I think, felt like he could trust me fully, hiding behind the cloak of a pseudonym, and felt free to speak so candidly. And while it's a difficult read, hearing about some of the things he did, I'm very happy he did, because it's important to make sure that we're aware of the fact that's happening. Yeah,
it sheds a light on what you experience day to day with the clients that come into your office. So having kind of gone through DW's account and Ephraim's explanation, does it ring true for you as to what your clients, tenants, say that they experience with their own landlord?
Absolutely. And first I want to say, first, thanks for having us on the show. And DW, thanks so much for writing that article, because what you called attention to is a very serious problem that, frankly, does not get enough attention in affordable housing and public policy circles.
What problem exactly?
Housing discrimination.
Yeah.
And that in itself is so pervasive in New York City. But the problem is, it gets lost in discussions, and the idea of how segregated New York is and how many landlords in poor neighborhoods will resort to these kinds of tactics that DW wrote about to force out tenants of color is something that can get lost under the radar. I mean, there are issues, of course, and there's a lot of discussion around displacement and gentrification, but I think if you look at the common theme, there are really two that emerge. One is these tactics that are used, tenant harassment, displacement, happen in primarily low-income neighborhoods with large minority populations that were often neglected in the years in the past. And two, they happen a lot in rent-regulated buildings. And as a result, they have a huge disparate impact on families of color. And I think that is a piece that needs to be emphasized more in the conversation, how tenants' fair housing rights are being violated on a daily basis, and we see it every day in our cases as well.
Now, I want to touch on something you mentioned, that it seems like we can kind of break this down into two issues, like you just said: housing discrimination and gentrification. Because from just my research, and not only just reading your article, but reading a number of other scholarly pieces on this, gentrification happens in all neighborhoods, right, regardless of color. We look at Greenpoint, Brooklyn, for example, predominantly Irish, Polish neighborhood that now has come in and become more of like a haven for what we now think of as Brooklyn cool. So are the housing or the tactics to drive out residents different depending on what neighborhood one is trying to, let's say, gentrify? So looking at Greenpoint, for example, and comparing that to, say, East New York, or you were in Crown Heights and you were in Bushwick, is there a difference there, do you think?
I would say it's a difference in degree, not in kind. And it depends on really how far along in the process the gentrification is. Neighborhoods like Greenpoint and Williamsburg, these kinds of tactics, frankly, were the more benevolent kind, so to speak. Now it's reached such dire proportions where landlords will destroy buildings to get out low-income tenants at any cost. And whether it's families of color or those who come from another country, the fact of the matter is it uniquely affects vulnerable populations, and in doing so violates fair housing laws. In neighborhoods like East New York, for instance, it is happening, but it's going to happen even more so if protections aren't in place after the rezoning to protect low-income tenants. So it's really just a function of what stage of the gentrification process these neighborhoods are at. But the tactics are, are not significantly different.
Wow. Now, DW, on your tour of Brooklyn, if you will, with Ephraim, what would you say you witnessed or he mentioned to you were one of the more egregious means of displacing tenants?
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, he talked a lot about buying deeds illegally, and this is sort of a different kind of displacement, not a literal one where they're kicked out of the home, but where they're left in a building that has little care for it because he's writing it out so long as he can before the foreclosure takes place. And all around the people in that building, the neighborhood's becoming more and more expensive. So they can't afford the grocery stores and the $4 latte and all the stuff coming in. And so there's a more figurative displacement that's happening where people are managing to hang on to an apartment that doesn't have the care they need, but they're feeling out of sorts in the neighborhood
from
they
their
used
own
to
neighborhood.
call home. And I think that's sort of an underbelly, a different version, if you will, of displacement that happens with the deed buying business. Otherwise, it's harassment, it's trying buyouts, trying to make sure that tenants do not talk to each other, because he'll go to one tenant, and if he can get them to accept a buyout to leave their apartment for $1,000, he doesn't want that tenant to find out that the guy upstairs asked for $10,000. So a lot of buyouts and very disproportionate rates at which he buys tenants out.
Wow. Now, Shaker, my understanding of how the law works in this particular area, in particular with regard to the deed buyout, or if a home is in foreclosure, a tenant is supposed to be notified, but tenants aren't being notified. Is that what you're witnessing to?
Well, oftentimes, I think, and this really applies across housing rights and housing laws, is and it's often said by a colleague of mine that the law is what you can get away with. And so rights may be strong on paper, laws of notification against harassment may be great on paper, but if there's no enforcement mechanism behind them, then a lot of times lawbreakers see lawbreaking as a cost of doing business. So in a lot of these situations, when unscrupulous landlords resort to these tactics, what they're banking on is that breaking the law for them will not have any consequences. And in fact, has the upside of them making a huge lucrative profit off of these kinds of tactics. So they bank on loopholes in enforcement that they can exploit.
Does this $39 million plan by de Blasio to allow for lower class or poor working class tenants to be able to fight landlord harassment, do you think that that would be an effective tool to assist to make sure that notification is being made, to ensure that a lot of these loopholes, even not necessarily get closed, because that would be something that the legislature will have to do, but get enforced in a certain kind of way that, have we seen through DW's reporting, just kind of happens and no one really is able to do anything about it?
Well, it's a step forward and it's a step in the right direction, but it's not going to be enough to solve the problem. And it's great in that because of this effort by the administration, there'll be more resources to defend tenants in these situations. But there are more fundamental sort of systemic issues that need to be addressed. A, when rezonings happen themselves, what provisions are there to ensure that the speculation and displacement that starts even before the rezoning happens, what provisions are there to end that and make sure it doesn't exacerbate existing segregation? The second piece is, what is the city doing? And it's really city and state government. What are they doing to comprehensively protect tenants' fair housing rights? And that's a major problem that our government has not addressed yet, which is, how do we ensure that actions like rezonings or development don't perpetuate or exacerbate longstanding residential segregation? And until state government or city government gets real about housing discrimination, that's going to continue, and it's going to happen playing out in everyday encounters that no one knows about or sees unless those stories come forward, like what DW reported.
Wow, and DW, in your story, comparisons are being made to that front page New York Times story that came out last week about nail salons, right? Mm-hmm. Everyone was reading that story. Cuomo came out and talked about how we need to go talk to our nail technicians and institute changes and inspections are going to be done. Lots of people are reading your article as well. What's the reaction that you've been getting, not necessarily just from the general public, but from politicians, legislative officials? What's that reaction been to your piece?
Well, I'd love to hear more from the mayor's office. I've heard from a few folks in the city government, but not from the mayor's office. I'd be happy to work with them. But I think there's all kinds of calls. And June 15th is going to be an important date when the state takes up renewal of the rent code. And there are a lot of things that can be done there, a lot of great organizations that are calling for some very specific measures in terms of possible rent freezes in some of these affected areas, looking at not just creating new affordable housing, but looking at the shrinking stock of rent-stabilized houses. They're just being siphoned off one after the other, and it's such a slow burn that I don't think we realize it. So I think that's something that we should turn our attention to.
Wow. And what I wanted to also bring up is this idea of affordable housing, because East New York in Brooklyn is a test neighborhood, right? It's the first of 15 neighborhoods that's kind of rezoned for affordable housing under the de Blasio administration. What's interesting to me, though, about this affordable housing plan is that in East New York, about 80% of these homes are still going to be at market rent value. So is affordable housing the right way to do it, or is the way that the city is going about doing affordable housing the right way to stem some of the displacement these gentrification tactics are doing to neighborhoods in Brooklyn?
Well, I think you raise a good point, which is affordable housing raises the fundamental question of affordable to whom. And I think that is a question that requires a much more comprehensive discussion than has happened yet. Because if it's not affordable, or if it's not done through a community-based planning process that takes into account neighborhood segregation, takes into account existing displacement patterns, then affordable housing just becomes a tool for further displacement and gentrification. And I think, one example of that, which our office has been working on a lot, is the Broadway Triangle rezoning, which was for affordable housing too, but the reality was it has violated the Fair Housing Act and perpetuated residential segregation. The story there, the lessons as to what it shows about systemic issues of inequality and housing discrimination can repeat themselves over and over again in all of these communities that are going to be rezoned unless we get to the deeper issues as to what affordability really means and what integration really means.
Is housing discrimination a civil rights issue?
Absolutely, without question. It's a civil rights problem too, because it happens so much, and many times tenants are not aware of their rights under local, federal fair housing laws. And oftentimes landlords will exploit that, some of them. Will say no Section 8 allowed here, no tenants who receive HASA allowed here, no only people who speak English. All those things happen, and they happen under the radar. And really, I think the problem here is that this civil rights issue hasn't gotten enough attention in New York even today.
Wow. Now, gentrification, is this a symptom of a larger problem? Because we have deregulation of the housing market, for example. There's demand. There's lots of tourists and lots of foreign individuals moving into New York with the wealth of of lots of foreign nations that have been able to accumulate such wealth. Is that driving gentrification?
I think what's driving gentrification now is the flow of global capital, absolutely. I mean, these are not investors that live downstairs or upstairs from you. These are investors from Shanghai or Dubai or London or investment groups, not even individuals. So I think that detachment is quite dangerous, and we've created a situation where we've segregated the people who spend the most time in a neighborhood from the people who spend the most money in a neighborhood. And I think we need to find some way, at least in some measure, to make sure that some of the investment dollars are coming from locally, are coming from the community through trusts or cooperatives. I think that's an essential ingredient that's left out right now.
Now, just really quickly before we wrap up, is there a way to balance some of the benefits that can be seen by the revitalization of some neighborhoods? Access to better grocery stores, for example, not necessarily $4 lattes, but the regrooming of a neighborhood, balancing that with making sure that we keep the stability of a neighborhood, keep the character of the neighborhood. How do we balance that?
Well, I think, frankly, the obligation falls on government to make sure that they're hearing the voices of the communities that undergo this change or have to experience such development, to make sure that the resources and institutions that are developed respond to those who have been there for generations and respond to their need. And I think it kind of plays out in the housing context, in open space and parks. What is equitable development and neighborhood sustainability? And I think that really requires government officials to be out on the streets, in the grounds, hearing the voices of residents who have been here for generations and what they need.
Wow.
And I would add to that we could, it's a major task, but we could undertake it, reorganizing community boards, giving them actual power, giving them good training, even making it a compensated position with an expiration date so that it's meaningful and actually the community board can make votes that have meaning for the people who live in those neighborhoods.
Right. Now, given what's been going on, last word to you, DW, do you think that there should be more of a housing beat, housing reporting going on in newspapers to kind of keep track of what's going on?
Positively. I mean, just sitting outside before we came in, there were awash in stories. I've been flooded with emails from people telling me their own personal stories, stories of friends. They're out there, they need to be written about, and we need to learn them. Yeah.
Wow. Well, thank you so much, DW. I really do appreciate it. And of course, Shaker, for coming down to speak to us at BK Live.
Thank you.